So we're going to finish up John chapter 11 tonight. We only have 10 verses left, and that's 47 through 57. But to know what's going on in these verses, I just want to recap last week, and that was Christ coming to the tomb of Lazarus and speaking to him and raising him from the dead. And then it says after that some of the Jews believed, but then it says some of the Jews went right to the Pharisees and said, oh, look what he's doing now. You know, they were ones who were against Christ. So now that the Pharisees know this information and the priests, we're going to start with verse 47. It says, then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council and said, what are we going to do? This man does many miracles. See, this is a problem for them. But when it says that the chief priests and Pharisees are going to have a council, let me tell you what this council is. This council is called the Sanhedrin, and it's a mixture of, the Pharisees and the chief priests and the Sadducees. So all these grouped together called the Sanhedrin, and they are like the Supreme Court of Jerusalem. And each town in Israel had one of these groups, these councils that could form when necessary. And so when you think about it, the Pharisees and the priests had been trying all this time to be able to convict Jesus on something, but they haven't been able to. So now that he's raised Lazarus from the dead, they're thinking, we've got to call the big meeting, the Supreme Court, and do something. And the Sadducees, their ideology was that they didn't believe in the resurrection, like at the last day, and they didn't believe in miracles. So they had a real problem with Jesus, especially since he just raised Lazarus from the dead. And then the Pharisees and the priests, well, they were all into the Mosaic law, and then also all of the laws that they added on themselves. Their traditions, that they had a whole lifestyle that you had to live in. Jesus wasn't going to do that because that wasn't the Mosaic law. He lived by the Mosaic law. So they felt like he was a lawbreaker. So now you've got these two groups that don't agree on their ideologies, but guess what? They're going to bind together in their hatred for Christ, even though they hate each other. So their question is, in verse 47, what are we going to do? This man is doing miracles. They are not denying that he does miracles. Then verse 48, if we let him alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and our nation. So in the big picture, they really aren't even worried about Christ and his miracles. They're worried that the whole group is going to go after him, all of Israel. And then where are we going to be? And they're also worried about if all these people turn to Christ, that it's going to be like a Messianic uprising. And then if they have an uprising, any kind of clamor like that, well, they're not in authority, basically. The Romans are in authority. So then the Romans would come in and they would kick them out of their positions and they would take over. So these guys are only worried about their status, their position, and their income. You got to understand, like the priests, their income was these tithes coming in. Mm-hmm. And so this is what they were genuinely worried about. And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, you guys don't even know what you're talking about. You don't know anything at all. And he came up with this plan. Nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation shouldn't perish. So he's saying, wouldn't it just be easier if we killed Christ, and then we could all keep our jobs, and the Romans wouldn't come in and take over? But what's interesting about that statement is that that was actually a prophecy. And so it says in verse 51, and this he spake not of himself, but being the high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation. And not for that nation only, but that he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad, which that would be the Gentiles. But what I'm going to get to is that all because God used him to prophesy, this was an evil man. And God had used other evil men to prophesy. He can use anybody he wants. But this man was doing it unknowingly, because his goal, as you'll see as he speaks on, is to just kill Jesus so they can have their positions. It's not about dying for sins or anything like that. But I want to read you about verse 50, what pulpit commentary says. It was thought that the multitudes, if they accepted this Sabbath breaker, this worker of miracles, this religious enthusiast, this moral reformer for their Messiah, the Romans will crush the movement, will stamp out their religious order, and we shall be annihilated as the power of the nation and will be abolished. It is more expedient that this one man should suffer than that the whole of our positions should be sacrificed. So that's where his mindset was. And I want to talk to you a little bit about someone else who had no knowledge of God made a prophecy, and that was Pilate. So Pilate didn't know about the prophecies of Christ. All he knew was what people were saying, accusations against him. But you know what he declared? He declared that Jesus was the King of the Jews. And this is the guy who turned him over to be crucified. But God used him to make that prophecy of who Christ was, and that's why it was written above his cross in 3 languages. And then in the Old Testament, there was a magician / soothsayer named Balaam. And the king of Moab hired him because he wanted him to curse the children of Israel. They were encamped outside of Moab. And so he was just out of pure greed, was going to do it. But then God spoke to him and said, don't curse my people. So when he went down there to Balak, the king of Moab, Balaam blessed the children of Israel instead. So God used this soothsayer, this magician, to bless his people. But ironically, after that, he told the king of Moab how to get the children of Israel. He said, send your women in. And so he did that. And then they started having all this immoral sex. And then the women lured him to their god of Baal. And pretty soon they were bowing down to him. So Balaam earned his money after all. Yeah, so what I'm saying is God used that man, he used Pilate, and he used others. So this Caiaphas wasn't an evil guy, but God used him in spite of himself, and maybe even unknowingly, to make this prophecy. So the Sanhedrin, they were so worried about losing their kingdom, but guess what? In 70 AD, Titus sacked the town. So they lost it anyway, eventually. Then verse 53. Then from that day forth, they took counsel together to put him to death. So, like I said, these evil people bonded together, and this is the way it went. After this evil council, they deliberated on the surest and safest way to destroy him. The sentence had gone forth. They bound themselves to secure his arrest for this purpose. Some of their number, a small minority, including Joseph of Arimathea and probably Nicodemus, disapproved of this counsel and withdrew from their society, but the majority overruled. So this is a very climax of their perverseness, because they have resolved the death penalty on an innocent man. Then verse 54. Jesus, therefore, walked no more openly among the Jews, but went thence unto a country near to the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there continued with his disciples. So sometimes, Jesus had to physically, this is the second time he physically had to get away from them. Because if he had stayed there in Bethany, maybe hung out with the sisters and Lazarus and all that, they would have grabbed him and killed him. He had to make sure the timing would be exactly on Passover. Verse 55. And the Jews' Passover was nigh at hand. And many went out of the country up to Jerusalem before Passover to purify themselves. Purifying was not part of the law, but it was just kind of a tradition that they got into. I don't know if it's right or wrong. It probably didn't hurt anything. But it took about anywhere from 1 to 6 days, depending on their process or whatever. So now they're wondering. In verse 56, it says, Then they sought for Jesus and spake among themselves as they stood in the temple. They're plotting this in the temple. Isn't that ironic? What do you think? Will he come to the feast? Well, of course he'll come to the feast. Christ went to every single feast because that was the law. And he kept the law perfectly. If they'd even thought about that, they would have known, of course he's going to be there. Verse 57. Both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a commandment that if any man knew where he was, he would show it, that they might take him. So I'm pretty sure they told the house of Bethany that if Jesus happens to come here, you're going to have to turn him in, or you're going to have severe consequences. So that basically ends this chapter. And what's happening right now is the last week of his life. Because this feast is a feast where he's going to die. So this is the last week of his earthly life. So that's my lesson for tonight.